Hi, good morning to everyone, and welcome to this session today on managing communications. This is the unit that we are starting today, which is the 12th of May, and I'm going to be trying to cover the learning outcome 1 and 2 today in this particular unit. Now, just before we get into the unit, what I would want to do is give you a brief introduction about why we are looking at studying this unit, and the importance of communication in today's business, corporate, in general, in the world that we live in. Now, what we do is, what is the overarching aim of this particular unit is to look at understanding how communication and communication channels actually work within an organization. And we want to also be able to understand some of the elements of how data, which is, facts, figures, numbers, is then converted into something called information. And at some stage, this information, when it is further extracted in terms of doing analysis and also, say for example, reports and things like that, gets converted into something like knowledge. So data leading to information, data or raw data being converted into information, information being converted into meaningful reports, presentations, things like that is termed as knowledge, which is used by management for decision making. So for us, this particular unit actually aims at understanding and developing knowledge about communication techniques, and how communication and what are the various types of communications which actually take place within and between organizations, and what are the potential pitfalls, and how do we look at kind of arriving at what are the best practices to look at workplace communication. So in the learning outcome 1, we're going to be focusing on understanding, the key factors which look at information and knowledge. What are the stakeholders which kind of produce information, consume information, and obviously process this information into knowledge, and look at examples of 1 or 2 organizations of how this is then, used within the company. And the second one that we will look at would be to understand what is the impact of, workplace communication. That means how workers, people, staff, generally working within the organizations communicate with each other using various channels. It could be emails, when we look at emails, or verbal communication, look at broad channels like verbal communication, written communication, non-verbal communication. Sometimes you also look at the use of technology, which is now, kind of seen across, helping us transmit data, information, and knowledge, and that is the use of email, video conferencing. We look at other forms of technology like webinars, the one that we are currently focusing on. So we will look at some of these important aspects of how communication is done within a workplace, and the use of technology. So let me start by focusing on the. In this case, what we do is we look at defining communication first. Now, if I have to basically say that, what is the process of communication, sometimes what we will say is communication is nothing but it's a means of interaction between different kinds of people, and they could be for various reasons. Sometimes you will see that the interactions or the interaction typically tend to happen for business purposes within the organization, and sometimes we will see that these interactions can also be personal. Now, the whole idea of looking at studying this unit is to understand how people within the organization, especially at the management level, use communication techniques and develop best practices to be able to, interact and then send across important pieces of information to workers, staff, employees, and at the end of the day, use communication as a channel to get work done, to get things done, or to achieve goals, aims, and objectives. Now, in terms of some of the key things that we will look at would be to understand, how different stakeholders, what is the process of communication first, and in process of communication, we will also look at stakeholders. Now, one of the things that we will look at would be, if I have to define, say, the process of communication, or what is communication within an organization. So when we say interactions or process of interactions, that is more or less, when we are looking at doing it for personal reasons, informal chats and things like that. But when we look at from a workplace perspective, we define it as the process by which information is exchanged and understood by two or more people, and it is usually intended to either motivate, get some work done, influence behavior or attitudes or, opinions within the organization. So it will be safe to say that sometimes we say managers, on a daily basis, 80% of their job typically is direct communication with their colleagues, peers to get work done. And sometimes you will see that some part of the communication in a workplace happens in the form of meetings, seminars, get-togethers, emails and things like that. So it is all about, you will see that there's an essential element of communication or the process of transmitting information happening from the manager to the workers, to the employees, to the peers. Now, this slide basically talks about, how somebody could look at using information coming in from external and internal sources and then direct it accordingly to people within the organization for which they might have use for it. So in this case, external information channels could be channels like news, could be like bulletin, you get a newsletter, you get an email. Internal channels could be things like memos, internal emails which are circulated by HR or various departments. And then when they reach the manager, say a department head or a manager, he then has to filter what part of that information or that communication needs to go across to which part of the employee for getting the work done. A simple example that I would take here would be, say, for example, if in the HR, for example, in the organization sends across an email to the department manager saying that if this month, the targets are achieved by the employees in terms of, say, for example, sales target, they will end up getting an additional 10% bonus. Now, this communication comes into the department head or the manager, and he or she at that point in time needs to decide how this information needs to be disseminated to his, colleagues or his peers within his department. And some of the information that he or she diverts could be purpose directed. That means it is primarily intended to some individuals he feels or she feels that, they are able to achieve. So this will act as a motivator. In some cases, that communication will be used on a strategic reason to basically motivate employees to try and reach the best of their potential and achieve their goals. And in some cases, he or she will actually use certain channels wherein she will, or he or she, the person will basically work on the information to convert it into some sort of, a more convincing proposition and motivate them to be able to use this as an incentive to achieve the targets this month. So let's look at some of the other slides. So coming to the process of communication, this is something we need to understand. Now, there are three parts to the communication process. Like I'm speaking, I'm using technology in the middle, which is processing, and then you on the other end are receiving my message. And then at some stage, if you ask me questions or you stop me and you ask me any queries, you are basically providing me feedback, which is coming back to the sender. So the process of communication involves essentially four channels or four parts. One is the sender, which is me. Then the channel through which it is happening, that means the transmission through which it is happening. And then on the other end is the receiver. But the whole process or the loop gets completed when the feedback from the receiver is coming back to the sender. So this is what is actually depicted here in terms of the channel, and that's what kind of forms what you call the communication model. Now, over this model has expanded. There are lots of different types of models, and for which I'll send you a handout. Over the years, like Berlow's model, there are various communication models which are invented, and from time to time, over the years, one of the models which is stuck now is the modern communication model. Now here, in terms of various channels that we use, which is the transmission medium we use, we can transmit information using this medium. Now, when we look at the transmission, what we are basically looking at is that if I have to send communication across or any sort of information across, I can use various mediums to send that across. One could be memos, letters that we understand. You could pick up the phone and talk to the person. Sometimes you will see within organizations there are formal, boards or notice boards which are put up wherein there are monthly newsletters or announcements being put. Electronic mail, which is basically email, is what we use very commonly today. And then sometimes you will have face-to-face communication as well. And these channels of communication are then defined on the basis of richness. Now, when I say richness, means sometimes you will end up getting immediate feedback, sometimes you'll end up getting late feedback, and this kind of a thing tends to happen when sometimes you'll have the communication one-on-one. If you're having one-on-one, the feedback is instant. You're able to see the person visually, see the person. You can also comprehend and see the body language, and then because this is between two people or a group of people, the communication tends to be very personal, and there is a quick and effective feedback. Some cases, if I relate this to an example of an email, if I send out an email to you today, you might pick it up maybe in an hour's time, maybe by the end of the day, or if you're working, maybe towards later in the evening, then the feedback or a reply in the form of feedback, which is coming to me in the email, would be, there'll be a delay in that. So basically, when we look at communication, sometimes, you will see managers in organizations will actually pick up an appropriate medium for you to communicate or send across some pieces of information. So this is where it is becoming important within organizations, is that sometimes when you have to, appropriately choose a channel to be able to send across that message, because you want to get maybe a response or a feedback, depending on how quick a response or feedback you want with regards to that. Now, the other things that we use and we've understood is that from time to time, communication is also used as a medium to persuade and influence people. So sometimes you will see a form of communication is written in the form of a letter or an appeal, or maybe some sort of a letter which is worded in a way where they want to generate support. Can also be done if it is communicated, the message is communicated appropriately. So one of the key things from this particular slide that we look at is that you will see it is an art that communication is sometimes used as a channel to persuade and influence people or workers within the organization. Now, very briefly look at one or two slides which I want to draw your attention towards. Now, there are different forms of communication. There is verbal. That means like I'm doing this communication right now, it is verbal and visual. That means you're able to see my screen, but you're also able to hear me. But verbal communication could be face-to-face, and there are other mediums through which you do non-verbal communication. So non-verbal communications could be when you send an email, for example, or you send out a letter, for example. That is a non-verbal communication. So here, what we are looking at is sometimes different forms of communication elicit different type of response from people. Now, what is being said on the slide is that messages transmitted by human actions and behaviors rather than through words have this kind of a response sometimes when it is sent across using this medium. So facial or face-to-face communications have the most impact. Vocal communications, like you speak on the phone, like we're doing through a webinar or a video conferencing, wherein audio and video both is involved, has 38% impact. Sometimes you will see one-sided verbal communications, use of things like, say for example, in the olden days, Morse code and things like that will have a very low verbal impact because it's one way and there is a lot of time in which the feedback comes to you. So most people look at doing communication face-to-face. Now, generically speaking, let's understand what are the various stakeholders which are involved in this process of, communication. Now, communication involves, when I say sender, message, encoding in the middle, and then or transmission in the middle, and then receiver at the other end. So sometimes when I'm speaking, the sender is talking, but the receiver is primarily listening. So in those cases, in order for that communication loop to get closed, what we do get to see is that if the communication has to be effective, the sender has to send the message, and the receiver on the other end has to receive the message and then comprehend and say that yes, I've understood the message. So let's look at various stakeholders. Now, just as an example, now stakeholders, what are stakeholders? Stakeholders are people who are involved and have some sort of a stake within the organization. Stakeholders could be employees, suppliers, it could be government, board members, directors, or management, and these are all stakeholders. Now, when we look at stakeholders within the organization, what do we see is that these stakeholders make or help in making some decisions. Some of them are involved directly and some of them are involved indirectly. So when we look at stakeholders within the organization, we do see that when we have to send across messages or do interactions with these stakeholders, we have to choose appropriate mediums to be able to send across that message. Now, stakeholders can also be shareholders. They can be, as I mentioned, company employees. They can be management. They could be, investors. They could be customers, suppliers, and so on. Now, depending on the interest within the organization, some of these stakeholders need to be communicated appropriately. So what we will do is we will divide stakeholders into two types, internal and external. Internal are the ones which have the decision-making power within the organization, and external would be the one which have the ability to kind of influence the decisions being taken. And they are the ones which basically look at different sources of information to be able to then, pass that on or influence those decisions being done in the company. From an example perspective, investors, people who are investing into the company as shareholders, need what kind of data? They need financial data, things like profitability, things like margin, return on investment, this kind of data to be able to make investment into the company or buy shares of the company. On the other hand, if I look at an internal, stakeholder like an employee or somebody like say a management, somebody in management, what they need is information within the company. That means information about the performance of the company, things like, what is the manufacturing cost or bill of material, or for example, they look at the salary cost and things like that to be able to make effective managerial decisions to keep the company profitable. So here, some information, sometimes you will see from an internal perspective, you will see internal stakeholders need different type of information and external stakeholders need different type of. Now, when we talk about, the channels through which we send this across, we talk about formal channels of communication. Now, there are 2 or 3 types within the company. Sometimes you will see that you have what is called the upward channel of communication. And sometimes you will see that there is a downward channel of communication. So, and the last is, we will also see sometimes there is a horizontal channel of communication across the company. Now, these 3 different channels look at 3 different situations when they are used. The upward channel is primarily used when the workers are facing a problem. For example, they have suggestions that they can put forward for improvement. Simple example here is that a lot of organizations are now looking at, conserving electricity or saving electricity. Saving electricity means they can help reduce the carbon footprint of the company. So in most companies, this originated as an idea from people who are working within the shop floor or within the retailing space. They said that when we leave the store, we should switch off the light, make sure that the kettle is off. And these initiatives started off as small suggestions coming in from the employees working at the floor level or at the basic production floor. And then these suggestions went upward. And then at some point in time, they were adopted as policies after the management saw the merit in them. So which, the communications came from the bottom, or maybe the people within the floor level, and then it went upwards to management to be accepted. So other forms of upward communication could be things like grievances, disputes. For example, if a customer has a dispute and they want to return the product, sometimes what you will see is the person in the front desk or the till will actually need a manager's authorization to take that decision. So the information from him goes in terms of, he says, okay, can I go and have a word with the manager and come back to you if you don't mind, or if you give me a couple of minutes. They go discuss with the person in the hierarchy to which they report to, for example, his or her line manager, and then they get a decision, come back and then communicate to the customer. So this is an upward form of communication. Downward form of communication normally happens when we see policies, procedures, we see goals and objectives, long-term vision and mission of the company being translated down to employees from the management or the board of directors or the governing board of the organization. So here the annual targets, for example, which are set by the organizations, are then communicated downwards to all employees, all departments, and then we see a downward form of communication, like an important notice, for example, an important occasion, an important product launch within the company. There will be an announcement by the management, by the chairman or the CEO, and that would basically be downward communication. At the working level, when we see departmental working levels, what we do get to see is that there is horizontal communication. And in that, basically what happens is when I communicate with my own peers or my own colleagues within the same department, if you look at various companies and you assume, say, look at one company, for example, say a college, and in that, when most of the tutors or teachers talks about themselves and update or, talk about the progress and, various things about the teaching and learning, they're having something which is called an horizontal communication. And that is because it is looking at updating, uprising, looking at solving problems themselves, or, looking at handing over, taking over, and those kind of things which are basically involved in the coordination aspect of running a function or a department will be then classified as something called horizontal communication. So these are some examples that you can look at when we talk about, downward communication, as I explained. So one of the good examples could be to look at, the annual plan, or the, say, for example, the goals and targets which are given by the management or set by the management are communicated downwards. The job description, for example, when you get inducted into an organization from the HR department, you're given a job description, or if you are given some instructions to be able to carry out a job, would basically be downward communication. Now, upward communication, some examples are like things like problems at the front desk, customer issues, you need authorization, and sometimes the people at the front desk have to have an approval, or get an approval from their manager to be able to authorize something, and that would show a form of communication. When we look at horizontal examples that we've looked at here is when you look at discussions happening at the same level within departments, say within marketing department, if they're trying to put together a plan, what you will see is that there are communications happening which will primarily be between the advertising manager and the promotions manager, or maybe colleagues within the same department. They're basically what you call horizontal form of communication. The other thing which I want to focus on would be the things that when we look at communication happening at the organization level, we will call this as business communication, because it is primarily being done to transact business, or it's basically being done to look at formalize interactions. So what are the ways through which you will see different communications happening at the business level? And these would include things like we do meetings. What we do is we do meetings essentially, and these meetings could be meetings or briefings that we do, and these meetings or briefings could be essentially done amongst users of a same department. But the idea here is that different forms of stakeholders get involved. The manager might call a meeting, for example, and this meeting would be discussing decisions or planning which is required to be done to, say, organize a product launch or to organize an event. And in this case, what you will see is there is upward, downward form of communication happening, because the employees will get direction from the manager will get some suggestions from his staff, and then they will try and arrive at a solution through which they will run that product launch or run that event. The other form of business communication would be the form of emails and letters. So emails are written, letters are written form of communication, which can be used for both internal and external purposes. That means if you send an email out of the organization to a supplier or to a vendor, that is an external form. If it is sent across as an email to your colleague, peer within the organization, it is internal. Now, these communication can be used to convey messages, updates, and things like that, which are related to, for example, if you're doing an event. The other form of communication you will see which happens within business reasons would be sometimes you look at an HR manager doing interviews, or when a manager does appraisals at the end of the year. So what you will see is interviews and appraisals would be an important way of HR form of communication. And here the employees can be informed about the job responsibility or requirements for interview via email, letter. And in this case, sometimes managers will also look at, if they are doing an appraisal, they will look at basically, taking decisions on, say, your incentives, your bonus, your promotions, and things like that. Other forms that we get to see when you see notices on notice board, or when you receive a manual or a handbook, for example, an employee handbook, these are forms of internal communication. They are not supposed to be shared outside, so you will get this as an internal communication in the form of manual memos or notices. I'm making a presentation using a webinar, and this is also a form of verbal communication through the medium of presentation. and this is being done using the assisted methods of webinar, which allows you to visually watch the slide but also verbally hear me, and it takes the form of a formal meeting or a formal presentation. And sometimes when large groups of employees, staff, or people go into a training then can also be a form of business communication. But in this case, training is considered as a downward, utilizing the downward form of communication, because the trainer is essentially providing the source. A trainer is essentially the source of the information, and the employees or the people attending the training are basically receiving that knowledge from the trainer. So here, training of employees by a company, about the organizational procedures, methods, operations, things like that would be considered a downward form of communication. So when we look at some of the other slides together, which you can go through, is things like personal form of communication, which could be sometimes when you do within the organization, two colleagues are having a conversation, either you convince him, you're having a discussion, brainstorm, and they also will form some sort of clusters. Now, the other thing that I want to look at very briefly would be barriers of communication. What are the barriers? What are the potential things which will kind of block communication happening across various channels? So here, when we look at, because we are talking about managing communication and the context is primarily official in terms of business or an organization, what we want to be able to look at is that what is the goal of business communication? It is to transmit information or information and knowledge to different stakeholders within the organization. And when we do not see this happening, what we say is that there is a potential barrier, or there is something which has blocked that communication. A simple example which I'll give you is when we talk about potential barriers, and take an example of an email. You send an email to somebody, but the email has not reached the recipient. So what could be the reasons why the email has not been received? One could be that the email has bounced back. You've done a typo error in terms of typing the name or the address of the email. It could be that the email has been delivered, but it has gone into the junk or the spam folder, and the receiver has not received the email in the inbox, and that's why you will say, okay, the email has not been received. Can you resend it to me, please? So when we see these kind of situations happening, wherein when you're using an appropriate medium to transmit communication or transmit knowledge or information, and the other person, which is the intended recipient, does not end up receiving that piece of information, then we say that, okay, there is a barrier in communication. That means it has not been received. And in this case, what we look at is we understand, then we will need to try and understand what are the different types of barriers. So when we talk about communication and type of communications, we talk about verbal, we talk about written, we talk about non-verbal. So there are barriers which are there in different forms that we use are also different. So say, for example, barriers in the case of verbal communication could be when I write, say, for example, when I'm doing verbal communication using presentation right now, here there could be a barrier which could be technology. If sometimes you're not able to hear me clearly, or there is no clarity of voice in terms of you receiving at your end, and sometimes if you see that there's a bit of a distortion in the voice, then this is a technological barrier in the communication that I have identified. You will also see sometimes when verbal communication is being done, say, for example, telephone lines, video conferencing, webinars, they undergo a routine performance maintenance or performance checks, because these channels have to be actively maintained to ensure that they are able to deliver when they are used for the process of sending and receiving information. So in this case, if they are not properly maintained, you will see that they will tend to become a barrier. That means the information might not be transmitted on time or as intended, and these are then termed as barriers. So the barriers between sender and receiver in the case of verbal communication would tend to be a barrier which blocks the information going through. Now, if the information being transmitted does not have a clarity in terms of right meaning, then in that case we could also say that sometimes when the messages go across, they seem to be ambiguous. They do not have a clear, message in the information itself. Then we can also say, if that is the case, then that, because it's being sent through as a written message by email, letter, memo, notice, whatever it is, if it does not have clear action points in terms of what needs to be achieved, then we say that there is a lack of clarity in the written message. Say, for example, if I send an email, a manager sends an email to the employees to say, okay, we are doing this, we are doing this, we are doing this. And then this email basically is a form of information going across to the employees. But the manager has not written what needs to be done using this information. So if written message is sent across but does not have clarity, does not clearly define the objectives or the goals which have to be done or achieved, then in that case, you will find sometimes the communication, the written communication does not achieve the intended outcome, and this can also be a barrier. So, for example, use of a lot of technical jargons, use of ambiguous words, use of acronyms in the communication might hamper this to be fully understood by employees on the other side or on the other hand. Now, technological barriers are easy to understand because sometimes you see that there's a poor connection. You're trying to have a video conferencing or a FaceTime or things like that, and sometimes you do not have the good bandwidth. You will say there's a poor connection, and that means there is a barrier. That means you're not able to transmit video and transmit voice, and those could be technological barriers. Now, the other barriers that we also look at sometimes would be barriers that we face, which are primarily because of when non-verbal communication happens. That means you are basically, say for example, sending a written message, and that written message or a letter which has been sent in the post does not arrive on time. So in that case, that barrier primarily seems to be delay in terms of that information, letter, memo being received, and that could be because of various reasons. It could be, delay in the postal system, things like that. That would also be a physical barrier. So essentially, when we look at, the process of communication, we're trying to understand what are the different barriers that you can face or have when you are using, some of the channels to communicate information, knowledge to stakeholders. So some of these barriers could be, barriers which are technological. It could be barriers which are primarily in, interpersonal. Some of them could be barriers which are because of, right message not being communicated. And those are what are summarized here on this table. So barriers, when I talk about interpersonal, they could be individual. That means the person, sometimes you're trying to have a civilized conversation or have a conversation with an individual. The person on the other side seems to be quite aggressive, does not give you the opportunity to speak. Then those are interpersonal barriers that you will see, wherein the person on the other side needs to have the patience to also give other persons in the conversation a chance to speak. Barriers could be because of channels and media. So these could be different channels. If you're using verbal, non-verbal, written, then technological. So media could be technological. And then what sometimes we also see is, barriers which could be because of semantics. That means knowledge of others and others' perspective. And that could be something which is to do with, barriers on that side. Now, in terms of sometimes, let's put it this way, sometimes looking at, workplace communications. Let's summarize. So when we look at workplace communication, there are three things that we look at. One is the medium. Communication is a process, what it involves, different models of communication. We look at who are the stakeholders of communication within and then to a certain extent, what we look at is communication is being current, using what channel, and then how quick is the feedback being received from the receiver. And the third thing that we looked at today was basically to understand what are the potential barriers which could affect communication having, which could affect you having the interaction or you having the communication with the intended person. And there, the barriers could be various types, and we look at, barriers like technological barriers, barriers in verbal communication, barriers in, written communication. We also look at interpersonal relationships, and sometimes we also look at semantics or behavioral factors which basically could affect different communication because of culture, diversity, semantics in terms of understanding of the other side, other person, and also how the message then could be culturally interpreted when it is sent across in different across different cultures. An example there would be, if you look at the Japanese culture, they normally would, if they give you a business card, they will give it to you with both hands. If you look at that American side of culture, what will happen is if you are introducing yourself and you give your business card, you give it with one hand, and that's considered okay. But in the case of Chinese, Korean culture, they also give the business card and also bend slightly forward, and that is a gesture to show that they are honored to share their details with you when they meet you in person. But this in the American culture or the European culture is primarily not required, and you just introduce yourself formally and you exchange your business card. So sometimes you will see these interpersonal barriers are seen or interpreted as different barriers. These gestures, which basically could be seen as barriers or the way how they are interpreted across different cultures. Which essentially means that sometimes an organizational culture will be influenced by the cultural diversity or the geography in which they are located, and you will see that the dress up, the style, the body language also plays an important part in that aspect. So this helps us cover learning outcome 1 today, and let's very briefly look at the tasks which are actually given, in I would say, the assignment. So give me 1 second. So let's open that very briefly. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, now, apart from this, what I'm going to do is basically send you a quick presentation, which basically also talks about the various communication models. And those communication models, that I want to primarily talk about, would be, for you to understand, a bit of a background, on the various models and how communication channels have evolved actually over the years. So let me just very briefly see if I can quickly open that. Yep, so that's the one which I would send across to you as well. So if I just share this this window. So here what we are looking at is, if you look at this, how business communicates. These which I'm going to send across to you as a handout. So this is the process that we discussed, how communication happens, senders, message, receiver, and then the feedback, completing the the whole chain reaction. Different models have come across, but the contemporary model is now more or less being used in most businesses, organizations, as a more modern form of communication channel. So here this is a bit of background knowledge and reading, just to understand what to ask. If you are asked a question, and obviously asked a question about the different types of communication model, then this is something that you should have a bit of knowledge about. But over the years, different models have emerged. Model of communication is now considered the modern day style of communication model, business. And then a good summary would be to look at different forms that we do in terms of how we communicate. So it's written communication, verbal communication, visual communication, and then electronic communication. So 4 different forms that we look at is cases, and I would kind of ask you to go through this particular, which I'm also going to upload on, kind of provide you very concise information about the topics and gives you the advantage. So let's very briefly look at the assignment brief also of of this particular unit. And if you give me 1 second just to discuss the first LO that we've covered today. Just give me 1 second. So if you look at this is the assignment brief, and what we're looking at is there's a bit of a scenario which has been given. In activity 1, outcome 1, it says the first part of training package will deal with information and knowledge which is communicated by examples, either from your own experiences or from the case study which has been given here by ATHE as an organization. So it says, using presentation materials, you must cover the following topics. So the first part is analyze key information and knowledge requirements for a range of stakeholders in the organization. So here you have to pick up a company. It could be any company, and you have to talk about the stakeholders and what their information requirements are. So an example here would be, say, let's pick up Microsoft, and you look at Microsoft, there are 4 or 5 different types of stakeholders in the organization. What I would suggest is you have employees, you have suppliers, you have employees, suppliers, directors, board members, shareholders. And what we have to look at is what are the different types of information each of this stakeholder wants. The second part we'll talk about, it basically asks you to do is explanation of systems used for communicating this information. So what are the various systems which are used by managers or people in that position to be able to communicate information to, in any situation. So here we have to talk about, basic things like how information is actually communicated, and those could be things like which we discussed, emails, memos, newsletters, interview and appraisals. We talked about meetings and briefings, letters which could be sent across, and those are the forms that you have to talk about here. The third part actually talks about analyze the analysis of potential or barriers to effective communication. So here, the barriers that we've spoken about, things like when we are using verbal communication, what are the barriers? Barriers could be clarity in terms of tone of voice. It could be, say for example, delay in terms of communication happening because of the medium being used. When we talk about potential barriers, we could also talk about things like if you're sending something across in written form of communication, the clarity in terms of message could be a form of barrier, and that could be because you've used too many jargons, too many acronyms, or technical language which is not easily understood by employees or staff to which is intended. You could also look at technological barriers. We talk about poor connections, sometimes mails not being delivered, or the feedback not being available because of reception. So those are technological barriers that we could talk about. In terms of interpersonal barriers, it could be personal conflict, it could be people not on the same wavelength, it could be things like the persons engaging in face-to-face interaction having a bit of a interpersonal problem in terms of communication. That could be one of the barriers. When we look at culture, for example, one of the barriers. So what you have to do is basically pick these examples up as potential barriers when we look at the channels of communication. So we are looking at covering just 8 tasks, and what I just is only cover. My session will be after this session. If you can get down and get to a working draft of this document, that working draft of the document can be sent across to us, at Learner Work University, and that will allow us to provide you on feedback to say that okay, this is something which is okay, this is something which is you need to rework on, and then we can progress that towards the final assignment. So once again, look at what we've done today. We've covered outcome 1 today, which is to understand information and knowledge, how it is communicated within an organization. We have also looked at briefly the aspect of understanding what are the various systems which are used, different types of communication channels which are used to send information amongst different stakeholders, and then finally we've looked at potential barriers of within communication channels that sometimes when we do and the communication is not effective because there are barriers, or the communication is at risk because of these barriers when it is being done. So we'll stop here for today. in terms of covering Learning Outcome 1, and I will catch up with you same time next week, and we will progress with Learning Outcome 2. Thank you so much for joining the session. Any questions, queries, as always, email, and we'll get back to you. Thanks. Bye for now.